Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Welcome to my studio and our second annual Knitting Summer School. I'm stepping away from my regular knitting tutorials for a few weeks so that I can speak more broadly about a variety of different knitting topics. This year for summer school, I invited my newsletter subscribers to submit their knitting questions and concerns. The responses I received primarily fell into three categories: projects, process, and fit and finish. Today's topic is process. Before I begin, I just want to give you a quick reminder that the best way to support the ongoing production of the knitting videos you watch and love here on our YouTube channel is by visiting the shop section of thechillydog.com and purchasing a pattern. While you're there, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter as well. Another great way to support our videos is by telling your knitting friends about the Chili Dog. If you love learning with us, so will they. Now, let's get started. Our first question today comes from Karen. How do I convert stitch patterns that are knit flat into knitting in the round? I find that the best way to make those conversions is by charting the pattern out, because a chart is going to show me what the right side of the fabric looks like. A couple things to remember though. First of all, when you're creating your chart, make sure that the right side rows that you're charting from the right to the left and the wrong side rows that you're charting from the left to the right. And since our fabric or our chart shows us what the right side of the fabric looks like, when you're charting those wrong side rows, be careful, because for example, if the pattern tells you to purl a stitch, you want to show what it's going to look like on the right side of the fabric, so that would be a knit stitch. So you need to make that little mental conversion as you're charting. I also like to chart out a couple sections of whatever the repeated stitches are, just so I can better visualize what's happening in the pattern. And pay close attention to the stitches on either side of the repeated stitch sections, because you may need to make some adjustments there since you're knitting in the round and not knitting flat. Our next question is from, and I hope I'm saying her name right, Agidia. How do I choose the right needle size in combination with the suitability of yarn and drape for a knitting pattern? I am disappointed every time a garment is finished and see 10 things I would do differently. Well, first of all, I'd like to reassure you, Agidia, that just because you see things that you're going to do differently the next time you follow up the pattern, that's not necessarily something to be disappointed about. As knitters, we are always learning new skills and techniques and about different fibers and combinations of needles and fibers, and that's just part of the process. Just make note of what changes you would like to make the next time around. As far as settling on that right needle size and yarn combination, I have one piece of advice that I cannot emphasize enough times. Swatch, swatch, swatch. Swatching isn't just about getting gauge, although I will talk about gauge in just a minute. Swatching allows you to practice your stitches and feel how your yarn and your needles interact with each other. Most importantly, I think, swatching allows you to sample different fabrics that are going to be made with different combinations of needle sizes and yarn. That will allow you to feel and see what the fabric is going to feel like, look like, how it will drape, just in a small sample before you get it into your larger finished garment. One thing I would like to emphasize here is that your swatching isn't complete until your swatches have been blocked. which just means that you're going to launder the swatch however you're going to launder that finished item that you're knitting. Fiber is a fickle friend. Whenever you are knitting a piece of fabric, as soon as it gets wet and is washed and dried in whatever way you're going to wash and dry that finished piece, the fabric changes. It's like magic. It can be a good thing, but sometimes it can be a bad thing. It's much better to see how that fabric is going to turn out by just knitting a small sample, as opposed to waiting until your whole garment is finished and seeing what happens then. So try different combinations, experiment with different combinations while you're swatching, and make sure to block, wash and dry your fabric however you're going to wash and dry the finished garment. And hopefully seeing those samples will help you choose the right fabric that creates the right drape with the right needle and yarn combo before you start knitting that final garment. The next question was submitted by multiple knitters. How do I get gauge? And this is where I'm going to reiterate the value of swatching. To knit a good gauge swatch, you're going to want to knit a sample, and make sure to use whatever stitch pattern is recommended in the pattern that you're following. Or if you're kind of going in your own direction, knit a swatch with the stitch pattern you plan to use in the finished item. If your finished item is going to be knit back and forth in rows, knit your swatch in rows. If your finished item is going to be knit in the round, knit your swatch in the round. Since gauge is measured across 4 inches or 10 centimeters, your swatch needs to be bigger than 4 inches or 10 centimeters, both across and in length. Bind off all the stitches in your swatch. You cannot measure gauge while your fabric is on your needles, because fiber is a fickle friend. Your fabric is going to change as soon as you wash and dry it. That means your swatch has to be blocked or washed and dried in whatever way your finished product is going to be washed and dried. Finally, it's time to measure our stitches and rows or rounds. Make sure that you're measuring across at least 4 inches. Make sure that you're measuring in multiple places and maybe doing an average, because not every stitch or row or round is going to be the exact same size. So generally when I'm swatching, I measure in at least 3 places in the swatch, just so I can account for any discrepancies. And if you have partial stitches, which is entirely possible, those count as whole stitches in your gauge. So if you're measuring across your stitches and you have 31.5 stitches across 4 inches, your gauge would actually be 32 stitches per 4 inches. So now that you've measured your gauge, if you need more stitches per inch or centimeter, choose a smaller needle size or try a different needle material and repeat the swatching process. If you need less stitches per inch or centimeter, go ahead and choose a larger needle size or a different needle material and repeat the process. And there are a few other factors that can influence your gauge when you're swatching. One of them is mood. If you're in a bad mood or upset or worried about something, chances are your stitches and rows and rounds are going to be tighter. And if you're feeling pretty good, they may be a little bit looser. So just be aware of that. Also, your knitting style can impact your gauge. So if you need to make small alterations to your gauge, you may try knitting with a different knitting style. Our final process question today comes from Maria. How do I get the correct row gauge? I know how to get the stitch gauge by varying the size of the needle, but how can I influence the number of rows per inch or centimeter? I know this is important when you want sweaters to match where the increase-decrease shaping occurs. First, I'm going to tell you some bad news, Maria. There are occasions in knitting where you won't be able to match both the stitch gauge and the row around gauge. But before you give up, try a couple things in your next swatch. First, try going up or down a needle size. Surprisingly, sometimes this can affect the row or round gauge just enough without significantly impacting the stitch gauge. If that doesn't work, try using a different material of your knitting needle. Again, that's something that can impact your gauge slightly and maybe get you just where you need to be. If you are comfortable knitting in more than one knitting style, try knitting your swatch with a different style. So if you're an English knitter, try continental, because that also can impact your gauge. That's not an option that is open to all knitters, but it's something worth trying. Just remember that whatever knitting style you use for your swatch is what you'll need to use for your entire project. So if you've tried all of those things and you still can't get your stitch gauge and the row gauge both to match what the pattern recommends, pay attention to the stitch gauge and follow the pattern using the appropriate stitch gauge. You can make adjustments to compensate for a different row or round gauge. And here's how you do it. If your sweater pattern says that shaping needs to occur over a certain length, you're good to go. And I'm going to use my sweater here as an example. So if a pattern said that I needed to shape the neckline over, let's say, 6 inches, it's going to be 6 inches no matter what my row or round gauge is. So I am just going to do the math to make the shaping happen over 6 inches. If, however, the pattern says to do this neckline shaping over, let's say, 50 rows, before I start shaping, I need to do just a little bit of math to adjust for my gauge being different than the pattern gauge. So the first thing I would do is calculate what that original length was. So based on the pattern gauge, how long is that 50 rows? Once I know that length, then again, I'm good to go because I can make my shaping happen over whatever this length is, no matter what my row or round gauge is. Something to remember as you're making these adjustments, both gauge and pattern dimensions are given for blocked, washed, and dried fabric. So make sure you're not just measuring your project that you're knitting to make these changes. Remember that you need to calculate it out because your fabric changes after blocking. So just something to think about. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode on process. Next week at summer school, we're going to be talking about fit and finish. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!